Hello, everybody, and welcome to United Tagaru Canada's webinar on Isaias in Ethiopia, and where we will be talking about the role of Isaias and Eritrea in Ethiopia. We are honored to have Yosief Gebrehiwot as our guest and sole panelist today. Thank you very much for coming today, Yosief. Could you do us a favor and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to understand the Eritrean regime so deeply?
Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you also for our listeners. I don't think, this question is rather, I don't think that the case of Eritrea was difficult to tell. The problem was not so much that it was hard to find the information, but that people were unwilling to give that information, and for various reasons. The first thing was, when the Tagadelti, or the liberation fighters, entered Asmara, in 1991, there were about 100,000 of them. It was a huge group of population. And then the population of the nation was almost around 2-point-something million. So compared to the population, it was a huge population group. But none of those, not even a single Tagadalai, was willing to tell what went on through those years in Meda, in the field. None of them. There were two reasons for that. Number one was the horror that they had passed through. It was so terrifying that they were really afraid of what would happen to them if they speak up. That was one. But the second one was more interesting because there was this image, this romanticized and pristine image of Gedli, of the revolution, that they don't want to mess up with, because they also used to profit from that. Because the people were, venerating them. They were putting them in a pedestal, they were looking at them as heroes. And therefore, if they began to talk about the atrocities that happened in the 20 years or 30 years that they have been there, then that image will be marred. So as a result of that, there was this conspiracy. You could tell, it's ironic, but there was this conspiracy to remain silent about what has happened in Meda. Another one is, of course, the population itself. The population also had some rumors. We all had had some rumors about what was going on over there, but nobody knew exactly what they were and the extent to which they were being practiced in Meda. Now, the population also didn't want to know about the past, because they were also exulting, in that image of Eritrea, the patriotic Eritrea, on the romanticized, on that pristine image of Gedli, of the revolution. So this conspiracy between Tagadelti and the civilian population was the main problem. But once, the crisis started after the border war, then it became easy to tell exactly what was happening then. People began to talk about the massacres that have been going on in the 20 years in Sahel. Sahel was literally a killing field, not only because, and for the obvious reasons, that there was various wararas, invasions of Ethiopia, and as a result of that, tens of thousands of Tagadelti were being martyred. So that was clear. But what was not known are two other aspects that made Sahel a killing field. The other one is the role of Halwa Sawra. Halwa Sawra, which means the defender of the revolution. It was the security apparatus, the dreaded security apparatus of Sha'biya. In the hands of Halwa Sawra, thousands have been killed. Thousands of Tagadelti were being killed. In fact, the first guy to tell us about that was Takhla Aden, who himself was heading the Halwa Sawra. In 1980, when he surrendered to Ethiopia, because of I mean, he was escaping from Sha'biya. He said that under his supervision, you know, he knew exactly what was going on in Halawa Thawra. About 3,000 of the Tagadelti were killed in that Halawa Thawra. But that was by 1980, by the early 1980s. And that killing continued until 1990s, until the Independence Day. So you could say about 4,000 or 5,000 people were killed by Sha'biya, by the apparatus, by the security apparatus of Sha'biya. That was the extent to which the brutality was going on. Another aspect was how most of the wars that were being conducted in Sahel at that time was done by peasants, coerced peasants. Nowadays it's known as Gafa or roundups. What they used to do is they used to go to a village, Haili or Ganta, which is about 100 something soldiers, guerrilla fighters. Then they will surround the village in the night time, and they would get into the village early in the morning, and they would take all the able-bodied men and women through the barrel of the gun to Sahel. Tens of thousands. The number is in tens of thousands. Although people had an inkling of what was going on there, nobody wants to speak also, because the idea of subverting or telling something, horrific about the Gedli, they thought that it was unpatriotic during that time. So these were the events that were coming out. It was not very hard to unearth this kind of information. They were almost at the surface level. The information was almost at the surface level. Other kinds of massacres were also going in a different way. Let me tell a brief one, the case of Falul. Falul is an organization that evolved from as a rebellion against Jebha. Most of them were Kabesa students that rebelled against the Arabized Jebha. There were a few thousand of them, and it was in the 70s. And when they split from from Jebha, at the beginning, Sha'biya used to support them. But once they were cornered between Jebha and Sha'biya gave them an ultimatum. It said, either you join with us, or it was clear, either it will suspend its support, which means the Jebha will finish them, or it will finish them itself. They had no choice, so they joined Sha'biya. But there was something that happened then. These people were rebelling against an organization that were more tolerant than Sha'biya itself. So Sha'biya understood the ramifications of that. If it's going to let this rebellious group spread into Sha'biya, into the other, if it is going to assign them with other members of the Sha'biya guerrilla fighters, then it understood that the consequences could be dire. So this is what it did. At that time, it was fighting against the Dergi in Massawa. Although it had captured many cities and it had surrounded Asmara, it failed to capture Massawa because it was very hard for them to capture Massawa. So what it did was it brought the entire Falul rebels into the front of Massawa, and they were finishing off at fighting in Massawa. Almost all of them perished in the fields of Massawa. So this is, these are the kind of things that we were uncovering. So it was not really hard, but once we have uncovered these truths, these factors, then we began to wonder what kind of an organization it is. Me and some other, writers like Zekar Lubona and Gabriel Gwangul, we used to work together, and we began to uncover these truths, and then we said, what kind of organization could it be? Then we began to question, things like what could have the student factor, the Asmara factor, Asmara has contributed a lot, in a negative way to the revolution of Eritrea. And we began to look into that. Then we began to also look into the colonial factor, because the similarity between fascist Eritrea and fascist Sadia was too uncanny, to bypass. Almost in every step that Sha'biya was doing, it was imitating fascist Italy, what fascist Italy was doing both in Eritrea and Ethiopia. And then we also noticed that everything that it does was anti-Habesha. It was running away from Habesha. What motivated it? Anything, not only against Ethiopia. It was not only running away from Ethiopia, but from the fathers, the Eritrean fathers, who it concluded were at fault because they united. They were for the unity with Ethiopia. And then there was anti-Coptic church. The element that we have also seen nowadays in Tigray, when they attacked churches in Tigray, monasteries and churches. That element started early with Sha'biya. They felt that if they came too close to the Coptic church, then they are being anti-Eritrean. So it went on and on, with the Habesha element, and these were the things that we were discovering. Anyway, I don't want to go further on this subject matter, but simply to let you know that it has been a long process. It was not so much, as I said, that it was difficult, but that few people delved into it, and fewer still were willing to talk about it.
Okay, thank you very much. A very enlightening answer. Just a quick clarification. You mentioned several times that Sha'abiya, during the struggle, killed many Eritreans. Can you clarify why? Was there a particular reason? Was it different each time, or?
Yeah, sure. There were many, there were purges after purges from the very beginning. Sha'biya started split from Jabha. It was in 1970s, early 1970s, that Sha'biya was founded. I remember at one time, there were so few, about 300 or 400 of them, that Jabha was hunting them, and at the same time Ethiopia also was hunting them, that they had no choice but to leave Eritrea into Sudan. They were forced to enter into Sudan. So when they entered over there, the killing fields of Sha'biya started right then. The Colonel Bona is one of those people who was there at that time, who is one of the chronicler of this, and he talks about how 50 Eritreans came from Kabesa to join them while they were in Sudan. The Sudanese government was trying to separate them. It separated Jabha and Sha'biya, and it told them to go back to the Eritrean fields. But in those few months that they stayed in Sudan, a number of Eritreans, most of them blue-collar workers, were joined Sha'biya. They went to Sudan and entered Sha'biya. Now Sha'biya was so paranoid at that time that it decided to kill the entirely 50 of them, entirely the new recruits. And the reason it gave was these were jasus, or spies sent from Ethiopia. Some of them they're suspected as being spies of Ethiopia. Some of them they're suspected as spies from Jabha. And a few of them who joined them from outside, most of them from Europe, were suspected of being CIA agents. And that paranoia started right then. Later, some of them regretted it. Some of the members who executed them, they regretted it. There was not that much. I mean, we never examined it, but Isaias ordered it, and the 50 of them were killed. It's almost like 10 to 20% of the entire Sha'biya Tagadalti at that time. That was how it started. Next to that came, it was purge after purge. It never stopped purging. Next third came the Menka purge. That was the most famous one that every Eritrean knows about, because there were some students, the students that used to lead were university students, and they were already known, like Musi, Johannes, and stuff like that, because their names were already known. That one, almost every Eritrean knows about it. And because of that, that was a movement that tried to be more liberal or more democratic, let's say, although even though they were diehard communists at that time, than the Isaias group. So there was a split. Once the Isaias group dominated, dominated them, they were entirely eliminated except few of them. And new recruits that came were suspected. As a result of that, most of the students that originated from Addis Ababa University perished under the hands of Shabia. Few of them survived it. And those few of them survived have either recanted, most of them have recanted, and they were participating with the liquidation of the others. That was the first big movement that was entirely wiped out from the Shabia body. Next to that came the Yemen movement. The Yemen movement is almost like the rightists, on the right side. There is not that much, known about them, but that also took many others to be killed. But most of the purges have to do with purely suspicion. The paranoia was so great that anyone who dissents in any manner or who has shown any inclination of dissenting was wiped out, was immediately wiped out. This took probably the entire 20 years of Shabia's existence in Sahel. So it's one purge after another, one purge after another. It was a continuous purge, and for various reasons, of course. Okay, I will stop with that.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. We'll move on to the next question. Frequently, people point to the border and/or economic issues when discussing the Ethio-Eritrea war. So can you tell us what you believe to be the real causes for the war if it weren't those two issues I just mentioned?
Yes, you know what? For sure, it was not a border war, although the border dispute was given as a cause by the Eritrean government. It was never a border war. It has nothing to do with the border disputes, that is for sure. It has to do a lot with the economic crisis that took place then. But even that lacks explanatory power. If we are to ask ourselves what triggered the border war, I would say, in one sentence, I would say what triggered the border war was the shifting power of balance from EPLF to TPLF in favor of TPLF. There was a shifting power of balance, and Sha'biya conducted the war to stop that shifting power of balance. Okay, this looks a little bit enigmatic, so I will go back a little bit in history and try to explain what I mean. There is something that the Italians understood as soon as they landed on Eritrea. They found out that the nation was poor. It had no resource, literally no resources. It had neither minerals, at least at that time they couldn't find any, nor the cash crops that are associated with other colonial powers in Africa, like coffee, tea, cocoa, cotton, and stuff like that, So they found out that Eritrea was a very poor country, that they cannot exploit it in that way. In fact, the Italians spent more money on Eritrea than they could get anything out of it. So what they did was, instead, they decided to make a huge military camp out of it. They decided that it will be that they will use the human resources in Eritrea to create an askari army. They used maximal kind of recruitment. I would say, for example, when they invaded Italy in 1937, the population of Eritrea was about 600,000. Out of those 600,000, 60,000 were askaris. Imagine that. 10% of the population was askaris. And if we are to confine ourselves to the male population, that means 20% of the population were askaris. And if we are to limit ourselves to Kabesa, where almost 90% of the recruiting came, it's almost every able-bodied man at that time, except for Kahanat, except for those ones who used to serve in the churches, were recruited as a colonial soldier. So what Italy did was, Eritrea was so poor that it decided to use the human resources to expand its empire in Libya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. Now, if we are to assess how poor Eritrea was, we can look at the development of Asmara, or at the evolvement of Asmara. Asmara remained a small, sleepy provincial town for almost the entire duration of the colonial area. For about more than 40 years out of the 50 years of Italian rule, Asmara had the population around 10,000. In the early 1930s, it reached, that was the maximum it reached, was 18,000. Now, something happened after that in the 5 up to 7 years after that, until the late 1930s. Something happened because the population exploded, of Asmara exploded. From 18,000, it reached within almost 5 to 7 years to 100,000. It increased more than 5-folds within those few years. So what happened? What happened was Italy decided to invade Ethiopia. And so it decided to make Asmara the base for the invasion of Ethiopia. So a huge number of Italians were coming, both as soldiers and as civil servants. And also a number of factories were built to serve not only the soldiers, the Italian soldiers, but also with Ethiopia in mind, with a bigger market, with the bigger market of Ethiopia in mind. So we could say, literally, we could say that Asmara, not the sleepy small town, but Asmara, the city, was built with Ethiopia in mind. Okay. Now, if we take that one, what I'm trying to show is that when Sha'biya entered Asmara in 1991, to its surprise, it found out exactly what the Italians found out when they landed on Eritrea, that Eritrea had no national economy, that Eritrea was poor. And so they decided to do exactly what the Italians did. They decided that if Eritrea is going to survive, let alone thrive, then they would have to use Ethiopia as a lifeline to the economy of Eritrea. Okay, so they began to build the same way the Italians did 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. They did with Asmara. They began to build a lot of factories in Eritrea. All the businessmen that started to build those factories and other businesses, they have in mind, they did it with the larger Ethiopian market in mind. Okay, now the Wayanis or the EPRDF allowed this to happen in the 7 years after the independence of Eritrea, because they had no choice. They had yet to consolidate their power inside Addis Ababa, inside Ethiopia. So they cannot contradict. They had at that moment they couldn't contradict Sha'biya. They had to wait. But still, the balance of power was slowly shifting, from that of, as they began to consolidate, as the years went by, as the EPRDF began to consolidate its power inside Ethiopia, the balance of power began to shift. Then two things happened at the end of the 7 years. One is the Sha'biya introduced the Naqfa currency. Prior to that, it was using the Ethiopian birr. On the side of a few months later, the EPRDF also introduces a new currency. It discarded the old currency. These two events demarcated the economies of Ethiopia and the economy of Eritrea as never before. The crisis started, that economic crisis that we were talking about started right then. So Sha'biya demanded that there should be parity between the Naqfa and the birr, and that they should do all kind of trade with these two currencies. Still, with Ethiopia as the bigger market in mind. Now, what the Wayanis did, they said no. For the first time, they said no. They felt they have, consolidated their power in Ethiopia, and they felt confident enough to say no more exploitation. If we are going to do the major trades should be conducted through hard currency, and the minor trades along the border will be done with Naqfa and birr. For the Wayanis, this was the first time that they are asserting their power. But for Sha'biya, this was a discovery, or rather a test, that it conducted. It was, for Sha'biya, the Wayanis have failed the loyalty test. They failed the loyalty test for Sha'biya for the first time. Okay. Now this was exacerbated, made worse by the hardliners in Mekelle. The administrators in Mekelle were more hardliners than those in Addis Ababa. So they were pushing for harsher means of trade between Eritrea and Ethiopia. They were very vigilant in enforcing the laws along the border, the tariffs and so forth. So Sha'biya understood that, okay, this time it has shifted. The power balance is shifting. So it decided, it said to itself, if I wait for a few more years, then the balance will be totally in favor of Wayanis. But if I act now, since I had a superiority in the army, if not in the economy, then I could disrupt that balance. Either I could bring them back to the negotiation table, or I will totally destroy that balance. So Sha'biya decided to go to war. Now, on the EPRDF side, what they made the mistake was they never understood how the mind of Sha'biya works. In fact, up to now, they have failed. This last time we have seen how they were surprised when Sha'biya entered. At that time, if they have understood how the mind of Sha'biya works, they would have done one thing. They would have waited a few more years, still accommodating Sha'biya, until they built their army, until they consolidated their power more in Ethiopia, before they decided to cut it off. And the ones in Mekelle were almost, the ones, the hardliners in Mekelle have not an inkling of how this balance of power shift, was making it difficult. They had never had an inkling. So three things happened. First, of course, the EPRDF failed the test according to Sha'biya, the loyalty test. Second, the hardliners did the most foolish thing. And third, the Ethiopian elite in Addis Ababa, who understood the dynamics of what was going on at that time, were pushing hard to see the split between Sha'biya and TPLF, because they were supposed to gain out of it, and they did. Eventually, they did. So the three things happened, and that is how the war I believe the cause of the war started. I will leave it there, okay?
Thank you so much for that answer. We'll move on to the next question. We frequently hear from Eritreans. They say that TPLF hurt Eritrea and Eritreans, and this confuses many people from Tigray. Could you tell us either how TPLF hurt Eritrea and Eritreans, or maybe why people from Eritrea would believe that?
Well, TPLF and EPLF had alliances, and at the same time, antagonism is going on since the days of Meda. At one time, for example, EPLF did what it's doing today. It prevented when in the 1984 famine, when the Wayanes needed a road to Sudan. It prevented them. It's the same thing that it's doing now. So they had this on and off relationship with Sha'biya. We know that. But probably what changed this phenomena to the worst is probably the border war. The border war was, the narrative that was being the propaganda machine of Sha'biya convinced many in Eritrea that it was the fault of the Wayanes. So that was one of the for the grievances of Eritreans. But I believe the most pivotal one was the expulsion of Eritreans from Ethiopia. That probably, I think, had I believe it was unnecessary. It harmed the relationship between the two people, and many of people who were a little bit, suspicious of Sha'biya's doing, came to the side of Sha'biya because of that reason. So that was one of the main reasons. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean that Eritrea was innocent in these things. We have seen why, for the cause of the war. And even when it comes to expulsions, Eritrea expelled many Ethiopians and Eritreans before and after the war. As soon as it got independence, there were tens of thousands of Ethiopians and Tigrayans were expelled from Eritrea that nobody actually speaks about. And then there is, of course, after the expulsion of Eritreans from Ethiopia, as a tit for tat, the remaining Ethiopians were expelled to, and Tigrayans were expelled to Eritrea. So it's not as if the Eritreans were innocent, even in that case. And now, of course, we have this war, the Tigray war that's going on right now, which have also shown two things. That Eritrea, the nature of the Eritrean regime has become starkly clear to the people around the world, and even to many Eritreans who consider themselves as civilized, decent people. They have. It was a surprise for them to see those people who call themselves, they are cousins, brothers, uncles, fathers, going to Tigray and committing horrendous crimes. So anyway, I believe a part of it is, as I said, this antagonism, this relationship and on and off that has been going on between TPLF and EPLF.
Next question. There's a perception amongst Tigrayans that we are perceived by most Eritreans in a negative light. In Eritrean propaganda, or rather, Sha'biya propaganda, is there anything related to Tigray in the sense that it's looked down upon or shamed? And if so, how and why has Isaias or Sha'biya done so?
Yes, of course, but it's not as easy as that. The Sha'biya, of course, does what it does all the time, especially after the war. The propaganda machine has been depicting TPLF and Tigrayans in negative light in all ways possible. So that should be taken as given. And the indoctrination that the young kids that went to Sawa and to the national service. That too is for obvious reasons. We have seen the result of that indoctrination inside Tigray with all the brutality of the Eritrean soldiers. But I don't think that is the only one, though, because probably the main one is the colonial legacy. The colonial legacy in Eritrea. That's prior to that, I mentioned how Asmara has played a negative role in the perception that the Eritreans have on themselves. Even though it landed, the way I have told it, if you remember, it was not even there during colonial era. It came to exist at the end of that colonial era. So it's almost as if there's a friend of mine who wrote about Asmara by the name of Gabriel Gwangul. He said Asmara landed on Eritrea. It didn't slowly grow on it. It landed on Eritrea like a plane. It landed on Eritrea. If that, what we mean by that is that it was not even something that grew organically, with the people. In fact, at the end of the 1930s, when the population was 100,000, the Asmara population, out of those, 53,000 were Italians. There were more Italians than natives in Asmara at that time. Not only that, it was an apartheid system. The Italians were living in the middle, in the center of the area, and the natives were pushed towards the ghettos, like Abashaul, Gazabrhan, and stuff like that. So the fathers, by the fathers, I mean the ones who were experiencing Italian colonialism, never associated themselves with Asmara, because Asmara was the ultimate symbol of oppression to the people, to the natives in Eritrea at that time. They couldn't even walk what they now call the Avenue of Harnet. We used to call it Compstato, because it was reserved for Italians only. It was their kids who were born in the 1950s and 1960s, which I call the Gedli generation, that began to romanticize Asmara. If you are to romanticize Asmara, then you have to erase anything associated with it in the negative way. So they began to romanticize the Italian era. And they took themselves as inheritors of that legacy, of that colonial legacy. So much so, nowadays, if you have observed, I don't know if you know about it, Asmara is now considered a UNESCO heritage. That's purely because of the Italian, the modernist architecture of Italy, of Italians. They worked so hard to make that Italian heritage to be a UNESCO heritage of Eritrea. Even though they have a richer past in, for example, Massawa, which is its old town, is probably the one that should have been the UNESCO heritage of Eritrea, because it has to do with the local population. And there are also many other monasteries, for example, like Debre Bizen, Debre Mariam, and things like that. It cannot even come as an afterthought to them, because they considered that colonial legacy to be their main legacy. Now, what comes with that is this false sense of betterment when they compare themselves with the people from Tigray and with the people of Ethiopia. It gives them that sense of superiority, even though they have never worked for it. And even though it has been associated with all the colonial brutality, they preferred, the Asmara for them was a sign that they are a civilized people, that they are better off than Tigrayans, or quote unquote Agame, or the Ethiopians, which they call Adgi. So This was the false sense of betterment that they came, as if they are better civilized, even though Italy didn't even educate them as the rest of, for example, colonial powers did in places such as Kenya and and uh, uh, let's say Ghana, where they left even a university. In Eritrea, one cannot. The education system under Italians was ended only up to fourth grade. You cannot go past the fourth grade. All they needed was for you to be turjuman or a lower clerk. That's it. So even though they ignored all of this and they tried to make it, that's it. In the case of Tigrayans, it got worse because the Tigrayans were mainly who came as migrant workers to Eritrea, especially the ones around the border from Adwa and Agame, from that area, as migrant workers, because these were poor laborers, manual laborers that used to work in Asmara and in commercial farms around in many parts of Eritrea. So again, the association is the Tigrayans that they are seeing are to them below them. That also provided an ammunition. It gave them that sense of false sense of betterment. So the other one is the revolutionary era. During the revolutionary era, as I said before, the Eritreans were running away from everything that is Habesha. Anything and everything that is considered Habesha, you have to run away for it. The more you run away, the more patriotic you are. It's of course an ugly and defeating way of dealing with your country, but that's how they did it. Let me give you an example. For example, they were considered as because they speak Tigrinya, unlike the Amharas, they were suspected of being jasus or as spies. Most of the time, unfounded at all. Now, let me give you another aspect of it. For example, the Bahtawi or the hermit in the Habesha world is almost a permanent fixture in the Habesha landscape since time immemorial, since the introduction of Christianity. The Bahtawi is the ultimate symbol of Christianity in its self-sacrifice, in its prophetic, mystic, and apocalyptic sense of that, that goes with the Bible. In every way imaginable, the Bahtawi was the ultimate symbol of the Coptic Church. So as a result of that, you see it everywhere in the Habesha landscape. It was true in Eritrea, as it was true in Tigray, and as it was true in the rest of the Habesha part of Ethiopia. Now, the most derided, the most hated, and the most suspected person, it became during the revolution. If they see any Bahtawi anywhere in Eritrea, he's suspected of being jasus. So much so that it was the extinction of Bahtawi from the landscape of Eritrea happened during the revolutionary era. There was no place for him to be in Eritrea. That is the tragedy of Eritrea. You can see it, how it keeps killing itself. What our fathers considered the greatest symbol of their identity was being killed by their sons in the name of revolution. So you could see parallel to that how they hated the Coptic Church, because the Coptic Church was always associated with Ethiopia, and therefore they have also run away from the church. That's why they did the unthinkable during the revolution era. They used to go up to the monasteries, like the Marcos monastery around Areza, for example. They used to invade the monasteries in order to take the Wuldo Kahanat, you know, the children that used to take education to be halakas, to be diaconus and priestess. They used to round up those people and take them to Sahel. And they forced the Kahanat to take arms. This is not even the Italians did that. In the entire era of Habesha history, you never touch the monasteries and the Kahanat. That was understood even as the war went on between feudal lords or between one area and another area. So given that, to go back to the Tigrayans were too close for comfort. They were Habesha, but they were the spit image of the Tigrinya-speaking people in Kabasa. So for them, you know, it was the ultimate test. If they could break up from the Tigrayans, then they have proven their Eritreanness. Because it's easy to break up from Amharas because they have already a language. At the same time, they don't have a border with Eritrea. But if you break up with Tigrayans, then that becomes a real test that you are an Eritrea. Hence, the venomous, you know, the hate spewed against the Tigrayans. So I believe that the two main reasons are this colonial heritage as a result that came from Asmara, and then what contributed the Anti-Habesha phenomena that was prevalent during the revolutionary era. I believe those two are the main points why they have this negative image was given to Tigrayans.
Just ask that was a great answer. Thank you so much. Can I just ask one clarifying question? You've multiple times referred to an anti-Habesha sentiment within Eritrea that drives certain behaviors. Where does that anti-Habesha sentiment come from, and does it serve a purpose?
Yes, it serves a purpose. The idea is that if you have to build an Eritrea, it is the idea of building an Eritrea is a task that the Eritrean elite undertook. It was not the peasants who undertook that project. It was the Asmarinos, or let's say the elite of Eritrea, or the educated, or the students, let's say, were the ones who had that project of Eritrea in mind. Now, what kind of Eritrea do these people want is the question. Okay. The question is, it is when we talk about Eritrea, it is the Italians who built Eritrea, who created the very nation of Eritrea. And with it comes the map of Eritrea. Now, think about this. You are an elite, and you want to create an identity, an Eritreanness, based on that map. It's a foolish undertaking, but nevertheless, it did happen. So all their orders comes from that map. If there is a history of Eritrea has to be told, for example, then that history of Eritrea must not overflow the borders of that map. What happens is, for example, let's say, the history of Eritrea, we could say, the history of the Tigrinyas in Eritrea, you cannot separate it from the history of Tigrinyas in Tigray. For that matter, you cannot separate it from the history of Habeshas in Ethiopia. It's all intertwined. The history of the Danakil of Eritrea, the Afars in Eritrea, you cannot separate it from the history of Afars in Ethiopia, because they dealt more with them than with the Kabesa people in Eritrea. The history of the Muslim tribes in the western part of Eritrea is more associated with the same kind of people across the borders with Sudan. Now, what the map did was, it brought these three main population groups together. Now the elite are saying, okay, how do we create an Eritrean identity out of all these different histories? The foolishness of it was nothing should overflow the border of Eritrea. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that? By simply eliminating the entire history that goes across the border. You eliminate it, you entirely eliminate. You don't talk about it. Either you deny it or you don't talk about it. Okay, now having done that, so what kind of history is left then? Because if you are to trying to find a common history among the three major population groups, you will almost end up with a zero set, because they didn't have much in common throughout the history. The Danakil the Afar in Danakil have little in common with the Habesha of Eritrea. So the only part of Eritrea, the only history that they share would be under the Italian colony. That will be, so they start their history from the Italian, from the making of it, or from the making of the map. They will start their history from that point in time. Even then, they are not going to tell the true history of what happened then, because they keep romanticizing the Italian era. But still, at least it happened to all of them. I mean, nominally, because Asmara, for example, Asmara, it was almost an entirely Tigrinya city. So they didn't even have a common experience as a result of that. It's only that they happened on the map, you know. You don't find, for example, any Danakil in Asmara at that time. I'm not sure about now, huh? Because what for? I mean, they have a different lifestyle, huh? And they never show up. In fact, there were more Tigrians in Asmara, even in the Italian era, huh, than Danakil or than Kunama. So it's just the map that giving them the illusion of unity that never existed. Now, the only time they came close to have the same experience was during the revolutionary era. During the revolution, be it in Jebha or Shabia, various tribes, whether coerced or willing, various tribes, people came to join from various tribes, okay? From various ethnic groups, let me say, and from various religions also. So literally what we are saying is that the history of Eritrea started with the revolution of Eritrea. You have to cancel almost 3,000 of years and start. Literally what Sha'biya is saying is the history of Eritrea starts with me. It's as simple as that. It is literally asserting that it starts with me. Now, look at precisely because they want to run away from the Habesha world. This is how they have created the history of Eritrea. Let me give you another example. For example, in language, how do you separate? For example, language is supposed to be one of the things that gives you identity. So if we are to talk about the Eritrean identity, you can not only talk about history, but of any other culture, identity, and stuff like that. Okay. Now, how language being one of the main robust identifiers of identity, how do you separate yourself from Tigray? Where, I mean, it's not as easy as canceling out history. You can erase history, but you cannot erase the language. So how do you do it, you know? So what they did was, at the beginning, you know, it was trivial, you know, like the way the Tigrinya that is spoken in Tigray is different than the Tigrinya that is spoken in Eritrea, which is absolutely bullshit, because if you look at it now, in fact, with the internet and with the television, more or less the languages are becoming one in many ways. You know, there are small, slight difference, like they say Hezi in Tigray, Heji in Eritrea, but even in Eritrea, there are places where they could say Hei. So there is, you know, that without, except for the trivial differences, it's the same language. Now, what do you do? the Sha'biya was so much troubled by this. You know what it decided at one time, as somebody recently reminded me, it seriously was entertaining the idea of doing away with Greek alphabets. Yes, I could see your eyes rolling. They literally wanted to change that into Latin alphabets. They wanted to write Tigrinya in Latin alphabet. Imagine the stupidity of it. They came, I mean, they didn't do it. Huh? Probably somebody, I mean, somebody at least was sane enough to stop them. Huh? But the Sha'biya literally entertained the idea of writing because it would separate it from the Habesha world. It did next to it in regard to the calendar. It dropped the Habesha calendar, you know that. It dropped the Habesha calendar and adapted the European calendar, you know. And that was part of the anti-Habesha. It tried to run away from the anti-Habesha. I could give you, I mean, numerous examples, but I mean, I can talk about this for hours and hours of how they were running away from the Habesha world. It was a stupid undertaking because they were not only running from Ethiopia or from the Habesha world, they were literally running from themselves. If you try to run out from yourself, you know, the kind of creatures that are built are the ones that we have seen in Tigray. You know, those people are the ones who, for example, how is it possible for someone, you know, to attack his own history in Tigray, you know? Whatever history is in Tigray also belongs to Eritrea because they were the same Aksumite empire. But for those kids that have been indoctrinated that the history of Eritrea stops at the border, it comes easy to them to destroy a historic site or a religious site inside Tigray. It's as absurd as I don't know how to say it, as atrocious and as dumb as this. Okay, I hope that will at least give you an idea of what you were asking me.
Thank you so much for that. That was very enlightening. We'll move on to the next question now about Isaias and Eritrea's. Sorry, this will be about Isaias's role within Eritrea and how Ethiopians perceive it. So many Ethiopians do not fear Isaias because they are under the impression that he's an ineffective leader. Until Eritrea gained her independence in 1993, it was by far the most developed region of the country. Ethiopians see the total lack of development in Eritrea in the past 30 years, the rationing of bread, the massive exodus of refugees, and understand all of this to be the result of Isaias's poor skills as a leader. It is assumed that any competent leader should have been able to take Eritrea's huge lead and excel, especially given Eritrea's strategic geopolitical location. What would you say to those who see the lack of development in Eritrea and believe that Isaias just doesn't know what he's doing?
I would say yes. Isaias never knew what he was doing, but it goes beyond that. That's why I always am a little bit skeptical when I talk. It's not the right word. A little bit confusing when when people talk about Isaias only, because it goes beyond Isaias. We have to look at the system itself. I said, for example, a number of times to talk about Isaias without Sha'biya, without the role of Sha'biya, to talk like Hitler without the role of the Nazi organization, or Stalin without the Communist Party. So it's not simply that Isaias molded Sha'biya, but Sha'biya also molded Isaias. Not only that, also the people, you know, the plant people who were ready to accommodate anything that Sha'biya or Isaias says. So it goes three ways, you know, it's a three-way relationship. Anyway, let me stick to the economy part, since that is what the question of development, you know, in Eritrea. one thing that we have to remember is, probably we have to remind ourselves again and again, is that Eritrea is a totalitarian system. And as in all totalitarian systems, the main purpose is to control, to have total control over all aspects of the society. And anything that is done within that nation, such as economy, education, culture, religion, etc., has to accommodate that goal. If it doesn't fit within that goal, it has to be discarded, whatever the consequences. So the economy of Eritrea, we have to look at it in that way. So what I'm trying to say is that Sha'biya's first question is, do we have a total control over the population of Eritrea? Secondarily, it comes, the economy. So the economy has to fit into that structure. Now, there are probably four, but three main characteristics on how Sha'biya dealt with, or Isaias, dealt with the economy of Eritrea. The first one is self-reliance, or in Tigrinya they call it in a funny way, رأس مركوسة. That mantra, that self-reliance mantra, has been a carryover from the days of Meda, where they claimed that they survived through self-reliance, which was absolutely false. But still, that myth that Sha'biya survived through self-reliance, they call it بصفرنا. Now, when they entered Eritrea, that mantra still is there, that mantra of self-reliance. But why do all totalitarian states, by the way, have that mantra of self-reliance? And why do they do that? It's not because they want to, it's not that they are aiming for excellence, but they are aiming for self-sufficiency, even in its rudimentary shape. And why is that? Because the idea of self-reliance is important to totalitarian states, because they are trying to avoid dependence on the outside world. Any dependence on the outside world, like, for example, trade, or resources, or information, or even aid, as in help, is looked with suspicion, because they believe, these totalitarian states believe, if they began to depend more and more on the outside world will, at a certain point in time, exert enough pressure on them that they will have to change their ways inside the country. So it's directly related with what? With the first aim that I talked about, with that they need to have total control over their population. So they feel if they are dependent on the outside world, their total control of the population would start slipping away. In Eritrea, it starts with the NGOs, for example. It fired, for the first time, it fired all the NGOs from Eritrea, precisely because it felt that they were, they are becoming dependent on the NGOs, okay? Now, in reality though, Sha'biya is so poor, Eritrea is so poor, that there is no way it could be self-reliant, like, for example, North Korea, At least North Korea produces enough materials and enough food nowadays, at least nowadays, that it can claim, to some extent, to be self-reliant. But in Eritrea, it's impossible to be self-reliant because it's so poor. So this is what Eritrea did. It kept the aim of self-reliance intact, but it changed the way it does its economy. There are four ways that Eritrea gets income, the major incomes for Eritrea. Number one is diaspora Eritreans. It's the remittance and other things like 2% tax and stuff like that, but mainly the remittance. The remittance, because every Eritrean, there are more than 1 million Eritreans outside, and almost every Eritrean sends money to families now and then, because it's, devastatingly poor, the country. So Whether they like or not, they will have to do it. Sha'biya knows about this. This has been its main income, hundreds of millions of hard currency, be it in dollar or euros, every year, it gets. So this was its main pillar of economy in Eritrea. If you look, though, the diaspora Eritreans are in no position to exert influence or pressure on Sha'biya because they have to do it to support their family. So what I want you to notice is that it's still keeping the aim, the goal that self-reliance did for other nations, okay? The same thing with the slave labor. The second part is the slave labor inside Eritrea, where hundreds of thousands of young recruits spent years of their lives in indefinite national service. These people provide labor, slave labor, either free or sometimes with small amount of money. They work in the Sha'biya-owned companies, in Sha'biya-owned farms, some of them commercial farms, in Sha'biya-owned developmental projects like micro dams and roads, even in mining companies. They are used in mining companies. Again, these people are in no position to exert influence or pressure on Sha'biya. The third one is kind of a rental economy. A good example would be what happened in Asab. In Asab, you know that they rented out a base to UAE. So UAE is also in no position to, in fact, it collaborates with the regime to oppress the people. Besides, we have known the role of UAE and the drones in Tigray. So these people are also in no position to put pressure on. The fourth one, which came lately, but still now is probably as big as the remittance in the way it as an income source, are the mining companies in Eritrea. There are a number of mining companies, and these mining companies are also in no position to put pressure on Eritrea. In fact, they have become diplomats for Eritrea. Diplomats in a way, they have humanized the regime. They try to humanize the regime because they are associated with the regime in many ways. Okay, so this is the first section the other version of self-reliance that Eritrea has invented, that the Sha'biya government has invented. But if you look at all of them, Sha'biya produces nothing. Eritrea, except for the mining company, produces nothing. It is the laziest organization that you could imagine. We will come to that. The second part of the Eritrean economy and why it failed, as you and other Ethiopians and Tigrayans have noted, is that after the border war, it was entirely militarized. For two reasons, of course. It had no more the Ethiopian market. So almost all the factories were bankrupted. Many of them were closed, and the rest of them were monopolized by Sha'biya. Now, with the military, the entire nation became militarized. Eritrea became a huge camp. The way, remember the uncanny resemblance with Italy? The way Italy used maximal recruitment to expand its empire, the same way Sha'biya turned the entire Eritrean nation into a huge military camp. Now, with that, the entire Eritrean economy has to be streamlined to maintain that militarization. This is what it did. There are hundreds of thousands of recruits, most of them who have left the country, by the way, have abandoned the country in mass exodus, but still, there are still hundreds of thousands left. It has to train them. It has to house them. It has to feed them. It has to arm them. It has to serve them in many other ways, like, for example, their health, medicine, and stuff like that, the doctors, and so forth. So it has to do all of this. So the entire economy of Eritrea was made with that purpose in mind. That was the good excuse that Sha'biya needed to go back the way it's used to do in Sahel, where it monopolized every aspect of the economy. Sha'biya now found a good reason to monopolize every part of the economy. For example, most of the factories were expropriated and owned by Sha'biya. Many of the farms, again, was owned by Sha'biya. Trade almost monopolized by Sha'biya. Banks were all, again, appropriated by Sha'biya. And most of all, hard currency was monopolized by Sha'biya. So you could see that there was no room for others, for businessmen, for factory owners, for merchants. There was little room left. Most of them were bankrupted. Many of them left the country. And few of them still work over there, but they have hardships because they cannot get the money they need from the bank at the appropriate time, or they couldn't get any hard currency. It becomes very hard for them to get hard currency. Anyway, now the only rich entity in Eritrea is Sha'biya. Everybody else has been monopolized. With that comes the incompetence of Sha'biya in doing things. That incompetence runs in everything that Sha'biya runs inside Eritrea. The work ethic of Eritreans used to be great prior to the coming of Tegadelti inside Abiy in independent Eritrea. They came with the worst kind of work ethic imaginable. They call it Tamokro Meda. Literally, it means the experiences of the field. Whatever they have experienced in the field, which is horror, by the way, has nothing to do with civil Eritrea, with the civilian Eritrea. But nevertheless, they have extolled it to such extent, they have romanticized it to such an extent that nobody is challenging them. Nowadays, Eritrea is being run from the lowest to the highest level by the former Tegadelti, who have no clue, except for what passes as Tamokro experience. I mean, Tamokro Meda, which is fighting, and what else, they have been experiencing, the brutality that they have experienced in there. As a result of that, you could see one thing to note about that is the arbitrary nature of it. Arbitrary. That's probably the most important part that we have to understand about Tamokro Meda. Think about, for example, factory owners or businessmen or merchants. What do they need most? As in any other nation, they want stability. They want to see regularity in what they do. They would like to know how they are taxed in an independent way. They would like to have their resources on time. They would like to access their bank accounts whenever they need it. They would like to get hard currency, for example, if they are working, if they intend to import materials from outside. Now, that regularity, that bureaucracy, that pattern, that law and order, that predictive power, that respect for precedence is entirely wiped out by Tamokro Meda. Because if they put that, it will be independent of them. It means that laws are working, regularity is being working. They will lose control over the merchant class, over the business class, over the factory owners and stuff like that. They need arbitrariness. They had to intervene, interrupt, disrupt at any moment they want. So they are against this, this pattern that any market needs to thrive. As a result of that, they destroy the merchant class, and the business class. So that's another one. Let me give one example before I end this question. And I will bring Isaias here into the picture. Isaias always dreamed about turning Eritrea into Singapore, however laughable that is. And when it comes to Massawa, the city of Massawa, at a number of times Isaias have asserted that Massawa will turn out to be the economic capital of Eritrea. Again, he was aiming at nothing less than Dubai, the Dubai of the Red Sea. He wants to turn Massawa into a free port to make it, turn it into the Dubai of the Red Sea. I mean, you could imagine his stupidity and how he approached. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent in realizing Isaias' dream of turning Massawa into Dubai. Let me give you examples. The Eritrean Airlines was created. One of the main reasons was with Massawa, with turning Massawa into this dream. So he built a huge international airport, even though Asmara, it's a few kilometers away from Massawa. It was unnecessary. Still, because it was his dream, he built a huge international airport, and it was built through self-reliance, literally through self-reliance. They have no idea what they were building. Technically, it didn't fulfill the engineering needed for being an international airport. And ever since, not a single international plane has ever landed in Massawa, even though tens of millions of dollars were lost in building that international airport. As for Eritrean Airlines, it have already had so many lives. They started, it works for about 2 years, and the incompetence of Sha'biya takes over. It gets bankrupt. They start it again. I mean, they have done it 3-4 times. And they probably have lost hundreds of millions of dollars doing that. The other one, which was built literally through self-reliance, through Ra'sa Murkosa, was the Massawa Asmara Railroad. The Asmara, it's amazing. The Asmara Massawa Railroad, some of them who had sense, they said it has to be rebuilt anew, because this was a relic of the past. It was built by the Italians. Imagine. 100 years before, so but instead Isaias demanded that we will build it through self-reliance, and all octogenarian and septuagenarian workers who used to work in that railway were brought back to life to build the railway. They did their best. It was only an amusement for tourists for a year or two. After that, the rail lines began to get dismantled or to get bent, and they had some close calls. After that, it was shut off, and now there is no more railroad between Asmara and Massawa. The other one was probably a huge one. Was they want to build a road from Massawa to Asab, a project that was never finished. Tens of millions of dollars were spent on that project. Sometimes they bring it too close to the sea, and the water began to seep in. Sometimes they used too far away towards the desert, and quicksand began to swallow it. I mean, the incompetence is unimaginable. They have been working on it for 20 years, and they have made no progress at all. That shows you also another incompetence of Sha'biya. The other one was the expansion of the port, again with Isaias' dream in mind. There are only few ships that make it to Massawa, yet they felt that they have to build, more docks over there, and again they spent tens of millions of dollars building, expanding the port, which nobody has used ever since. Last, fishery. Tourism first. They also were trying to make Massawa the center of tourism in Eritrea. Not only it's an old city, a huge old city, a beautiful old city over there, but also the beaches of Eritrea. I mean, there is miles and miles of pristine beaches. Up to now, there probably is not a single tourist has ever gone and visited those beaches. The only ones are those diaspora Eritreans who go over there, who probably never go to swim. They just visit over there. A few of them probably they do, and that's it. The last one was the fishery. They were also intending, since Eritrea had 1,000 coasts of untapped fishery, they were also having a plan to make it a fishing center, for export. What they did is what usually Sha'biya did. It bankrupted the traditional fishermen, the Afars and the people who used to live in the coasts, It bankrupted them, but it bought brand new fishing boats, many of them. It worked for about 1 year or so. After that, the entire fleet of ship was ported somewhere idle somewhere in Eritrea. And up to now, there has been no fish, let alone for export, for Asmara, for the population of Eritrea. Now, I'm only focusing on Asmara, on Masawa, to give you an idea of the sheer incompetence and stupidity of the Sha'biya mind, especially when it is done from Isaias, when it's a brainchild of Isaias. So in all of this, you see, let me add this one. In all of this, what they miss is the human factor. They never, with all these white elephants that they have produced, they never ask the human factor. The human factor, what I mean is, if you have bankrupted the entire merchant class, how is it possible to turn Masawa into Dubai? In Dubai, there are thousands of companies, privately owned companies, that run everything. How is it possible to run a free port like Dubai, even a minuscule one, with Sha'biya being the only merchant in the country? They never asked that question while they were spending hundreds of millions of dollars to make the Isaias dream to change Isaias' dream into reality. Not only that, who is gonna come and buy anything from Eritrea? They never asked that, because this is a pariah nation. Nobody from Ethiopia, at that time at least, nobody from Ethiopia or from the surrounding country would come to Masawa to buy items from Sha'biya, But it never occurred to them to ask the human factor. Again, you could see the stupidity and the arrogance, all of it. Of how to. I think I went on and on with this one, so sorry for that.
No, it's a wonderful answer. I wouldn't have assumed that there was that much incompetence in Eritrea. I always was under the assumption that it was deliberate, 100% deliberate. But it's interesting to know that much of it is actually incompetence and stupidity, as you said. Okay, so next question. A lot of people, this is changing topics a little bit, seem to believe that Isaias and or Sha'biya are their allies. So the question we would ask you is Isaias Abi's ally? Is he Farmajo's ally? Is he Birhanu Nega's ally, or anyone's ally for that matter?
All right, okay. Probably you know the answer. He's nobody's ally, but let me undergird it with some kind of explanatory power to it. I use the term all the time when I explain the alliance that Isaias creates. I always use the term vulgar pragmatism. It's pragmatism, nevertheless, it's vulgar. By vulgar, I mean it's unprincipled. There is no principle that guides it. There is no morality that guides it. There is no rule or pattern that guides it. There is no ideology that guides it. So the only purpose of vulgar pragmatism is how do we survive? How do we make Sha'biya stretch its life, its political life? That's the only obsession that vulgar pragmatism have. And how do they? What is the means of reaching their goal? Any means necessary. Any means necessary. No morality. No, as I said, there is no principle or morality to back it up. Any means necessary. So what constrains them? What constrains them is they ask the question, can we get away with it? So it's only a force, if there is a force that they can reckon with, and then they would probably change it or stop it, that can stop them. But if they can get away with it, they will do anything. That is the vulgar pragmatism that we have seen, for example, in Tigray, that has been working in Tigray. Now, when we comes to his allies, let me give you a few examples on how this vulgar pragmatism works with its allies. Think about Al-Shabaab, for example. Al-Shabaab was at one time, it was allied to Eritrea. They had even a meeting inside Asmara, and it was believed to arm it, to finance it to some extent. Of course, the main purpose of that was for subversion purposes inside Ethiopia. But nevertheless, you could see that there is no principle, except for that one, there is no principle that joins them. Islamic fundamentalism, it could even be opposing, as Sha'biya was supporting the radical Islamic fundamentalism of Al-Shabaab, it was doing everything possible to wipe out Islamic fundamentalism in Eritrea. So you could see how the Sha'biya mind works. Another example would be South Sudan. It used to help the South Sudanese rebels to get whatever it wants to get from North Sudan, but it was not in any way interested in the independence of South Sudanese. It had, Sha'biya doesn't have even an iota in its DNA, an iota of Pan-Africanism. Most of the revolutionary movements during that era had this connection with Pan-Africanist movements, let's say in Angola, in Mozambique, Samora Machel, and all the others. But Sha'biya had never had any Pan-Africanism in its DNA. Yet, it would be willing to support the South Sudanese against the Arab North for absolutely ulterior motives. Probably the best example would be how it related itself to Yemen. At one time, Eritrea was arming the Yemeni Hutus, the Houthis of Yemen. And there was a reason of that. Iran approached Eritrea. Eritrea was getting money out of Iran, and Eritrea was helping, because it was very close, across the sea. The Eritreans were transporting the army that was needed to the Houthis. Now, the Arabs, with that bizarre mind of theirs, understood this logic quickly. The UAE and Saudi Arabia. What they did was they outbid the Iranians. Isaias didn't even take a day. He switched sides. He gave them the base in Asab. And the very people who was helping a few months ago were being bombed by planes running from Asab. Again, this is vulgar pragmatism at its best, because Eritrea needed money, so they will do anything to get that money. So their alliance with Houthis ended quickly, the same way. Now let me come to Formaggio and Abiy and also the Amhara leaders. Okay, the same thing is happening now. No principle joins. For example, Sha'biya, Eritrea, and Amhara. What could possibly they have in common? Except for the obvious one, finishing off Tigray. But what principle joins them? What ideology joins them? What purpose joins them besides that? There is none at all. The same is with Formaggio. What could they possibly have in common with Isaias and Formaggio? I mean, the context is so different, even geographically. They don't have, a connection, that it would be impossible to fathom why would they gang up at this point in time. So, but if you look it through vulgar pragmatism, then there is a reason why they are doing this. Isaias was doing this, was trying to create an alliance of dictators in that area for a simple purpose. Because unless an alliance of dictators is created in that area, the probability that Sha'biya's life would end quickly was there. After 30 years, after 30 years doing whatever it did inside Eritrea, I mean, Sha'biya was almost coming to a dead end. The nation was being depopulated at a fast rate. More than 500,000 young people have left the nation. The population also was getting fewer and fewer. Nowadays, it's about 3 million. And the economy was going nowhere. Even with all this, with the diaspora remittance and the mining companies. So, with the arrival of Abiy, he thought this was a great opportunity to create an alliance of dictators with the sole purpose of coming to each other's help. Coming to each other. Imagine, I think it was in this medium that I had given a presentation based on that one. But imagine in Africa, since its days of independence in the 50s and 60s, there had been various dictators in Africa. But it never occurred to them to make an alliance with one another. Because what for? I mean, a dictator in, let's say, in Kenya and a dictator in Ghana, there is nothing that they have in common, so the necessity of creating an alliance was simply not there, because they used to survive, by sponsorship of by the sponsorship or through the sponsorship of powerful forces. Like, for example, Mengistu he had the protection of the Soviet Union. Mobutu Sese Seko had the protection of Western powers, and so forth. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, there was no need for this binary world. And therefore, many of the dictators in Africa found themselves in a bad shape. Nobody would sponsor them. That's one of the reasons why democracy began to sprout all over Africa after that, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, Isaias, again, this is Isaias' brainchild, found out that the only way dictators could survive at least in that area, is by supporting one another, by coming to each other's help. And that's exactly what he did. In fact, his idea was to expand to South Sudan and Northern Sudan, had it not been for the controversy created between Ethiopia and Northern Sudan. Now, again, we see, these four dictators had nothing in common except for the fact that they want to maintain their dictatorships. That is vulgar pragmatism at its best. Now, what Isaias is fearing now is, if if Abiy's reign comes to an end, then everything disintegrates. There is no need for the alliance with Amhara. There is no need with Formaggio. So Eritrea is back to its old self, and it will be an isolated nation, a pariah nation as before, because that's one of the reasons he made this alliance, to get out of that isolation. The perennial problem of the mass exodus will again start, or will continue, and the economy will go back to its old, to its bankrupt ways. So there is nothing, in general, all that I'm saying is this alliance is purely based on that vulgar pragmatism. If you understand the concept of vulgar pragmatism, then you could easily understand the alliance that's going on now.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. I guess this next question relates a little bit to what you were just speaking about. What does victory look like for Isaias in the war that we're seeing currently?
Well, you're right. You know, it goes with what I have been saying before. For example, you know, there is two parts to it. You know, there is that vindictive nature of Isaias that wants Tigray to be wiped out, and there is also the pragmatic element in it, in the creation of this alliance of dictators. In fact, they focused on Tigray because they found out that it was on the way, you know, without making Ethiopia, without turning Ethiopia into dictatorship, they cannot have that alliance because it's the biggest nation there. So Tigray was on the way. So they understood that. That's why they agreed, three of them agreed to wipe out Tigray. Now, if you look at it, we have to look, what is it that Isaias wants, you know? On the vindictive part, it was to demolish Tigray. I mean, and more or less, he has succeeded in doing that. He destroyed its infrastructure. He destroyed its factories. He destroyed the farms, the food source. There are various massacres. He destroyed its historical and religious sites, you know. So he almost succeeded, but the biggest prize that he was entertaining was not done. That was both of them, the three of them, you know, the Amhara leadership, Eritrea and Ethiopia, even though it's very brutal, whatever they did, the aim was eventually to starve Tigray to death. That was their aim. That is the one part that has remained unfulfilled up to now. And that is, even now, you know, people talk about Eritrea leaving Tigray. I don't think Eritrea has left Tigray, not in the physical sense, you know. Most of the army has left Tigray in the physical sense of it. But think about this. There are three ways that Eritrea hasn't left Tigray. Now, number one is tens of thousands of Tigrayan army of TDF are facing off Eritrea along the border, which means they are being tied up along the border. If they were not tied up along the border, these tens of thousands of soldiers, probably by now, TDF would have reached Addis Ababa. So literally, without firing a shot, Eritrea is helping Ethiopia by tying them to the border. That's the biggest one. The second one, as Getachew Reda has said, on the western part of Eritrea, with the Amharas, they are still active, the Eritrean forces. There are many divisions in Adgeshu, which was the most pivotal area. If you remember, when Agenyo, who is that Teshager, that leader of the Amhara region, at one time when he was recorded, you know, secretly, he said one of the most important things he said was, if we are defeated in Adgeshu, that's it. And if we could defeat them in the Adgeshu also, that's it for them. That's what he said. So it's that much importance that they have given to Adgeshu. Now that area is being enforced mainly by Eritrean forces. And they have also, Eritrean forces are also in Humera. Now what that does is two things. First of all, they are preventing, you know, as I told you, you know, before, the main goal of Eritrea, of the three forces, is to starve Tigray to death right now. Now, if the one thing that they are afraid of is if Tigray gets access through the West Tigray to Sudan. So Eritrea has become very pivotal in preventing Tigray from getting that access. Probably that's one of the reasons why the Tigrayan forces are getting around it instead directly dealing with it in Western Tigray. Another part of that is that they are covering for the Amharas, as Tigray is marching inside Amhara. The soldiers that were camped inside the Western Tigray, they are needed more and more inside the Amhara area. So that, Eritreans are now covering it for them. So in a way, without firing a shot, Eritrea is now not only doing these things that I have said, but is trying its best to starve Tigray to death. Okay, so that's one of the phenomena, that's happening in Tigray right now. And so, if he could maintain that, that would be to him a huge victory. If he could starve Tigray to death, that would do a huge victory. But short of that, he wants to maintain that alliance of dictators. For him, the horror would start if Abiy either is made to resign, or he's forced out of the seat of power. That to him is a nightmare. That's why I sometimes suspect that he'll probably try to intervene at the last moment, to prevent that from happening. And that is why a huge army of Eritrea is now being seen around Bure areas towards Asab, because both of them, the Tigrayans are looking at blocking that road, and the Amharas, the Ethiopian Federal Army, and the Eritreans are looking from afar, but not very far, to prevent that. So these are for Israel. This victory would be one, to starve Tigray to death, two, to maintain the alliance of dictatorship in that area.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So we come to our last question now. What will happen to Eritrea after the war? Will we see democracy, more authoritarianism? Is it possible for the diaspora opposition groups to bring any sort of positive change to the country? What do you see happening in the future?
Well, probably on this question, your guess would be as good as mine, because it's made up of so many variables. So many variables are involved with this one, and so it's very hard to say exactly how it will pan out. But let me give two scenarios. Okay, Isaias, as I said, he can't afford to lose the alliance of dictators. But if it does, what would be his last step? Of course, his army is still intact, even though it has lost a lot of soldiers inside Tigray. It's still potent. It's still a potent army, unlike that of Ethiopia, who withdrew more or less, intact. So he still has that army, but he cannot survive without any other help. So what kind of replacement could he find? What I suspect is the only asset that Eritrea has right now is its 1,000 kilometers coastline in the Red Sea. That has become it's a hot real estate. If I can use that in terms of the powerful forces that are looking at that area. For example, Russia is looking for a base in that area. China is looking for a base in that area. So is Turkey. And obviously, the Arabs, from Qatar to UAE to Saudi Arabia itself. And another one that has been discounted so far is Egypt. Because even though right now Egypt seems to be sympathetic to Tigray, I don't think it will be sympathetic in the end, because what it wants is an Arab-dominated Red Sea. So it believes that with the independence of Eritrea, they are closer to achieving that. So a base in Eritrea, for example, a desperate Isaias, would he give a base to Eritrea, to Egypt in that area, to protect him from, of course, either a Tigrayan nation or an Ethiopian nation if Tigray remains with Ethiopia. So that threat, in order to prevent that threat, would he invite, for example, the Egyptians? Would he provide easily, bases for Russia or China or Turkey, as I said before, So that, to me, is the only leverage that he has left that he will use. That's how I feel, okay? Would they save him, or would he even be able to do all of this? But the end could come very quickly, if Ethiopia mobilizes against Tigray, if Abiy falls down, or if Tigray mobilizes against Eritrea, the end could come earlier than that. All right, that's one scenario. The other scenario is, of course, if Isaias, taken out of the picture, then what will happen to Eritrea? That's where I am not sure, because the variables are many. One is, of course, it could be replaced by a more tolerant leader, let's say. I don't know exactly who that leader could be. It could be from Sha'biya itself, let's say. Or it could be, I doubt the Eritrean diaspora will provide that kind of leadership, because I don't see how it plays the role. First of all, it's disunited, and rarely does this thing happen. I haven't seen any organization that has been created outside. Like, for example, they tried it. Americans tried it in Iraq with Shalabi, if you remember, and it never got off the ground. So usually, the elements that determine the fate of the nation are to be found within that nation. So when it comes to democracy, I don't think democracy will take place in Eritrea with the change of government. And I don't expect it even, because I do believe that probably normalcy will return to Eritrea. I tend to see the distinction between democracy and normalcy. In Eritrea, people, they say that all of this, whatever happened in Eritrea, is because of lack of democracy. No, it's not because of lack of democracy. It's because of lack of normalcy, the barest minimum of it. So everything is abnormal in Eritrea in that way. Even dictatorships have some kind of normalcy among the population, because people go to school, they send their children to school. Children grow up with their parents. There is no such thing as indefinite national service, where people spend most of their adult life, aimlessly roaming the wilderness, and so forth, So Eritrea is a uniquely abnormal state. So if normalcy returns to Eritrea, even with, let's say, with a slight bit of democracy, I think that would be a huge achievement in the case of Eritrea. And probably that's what's going to happen. I don't see, we'll see democracy thriving at the very beginning, if that happens. The worst case scenario is Eritrea is a disunited nation. There is no unity except, they always say, had al-Libi, had hizbi, which is one heart, one people. It looks like a reggae motto, but it's all illusion, In Eritrea, there is all kinds of divisions within Eritrea. It has been kept by in unity through brutal force. there is this difference between the Muslims and the Christians, you know, because the population is almost half to half. And there is this 5-decade divide, I call it, because it's not only Muslim and Christian, but it's also Tigrinya and Arabic, or other languages. It's also between ways of life, nomadic versus sedentary. And there is other aspects of it also, not only in language but also in culture. There is a distinct culture in the lowlands, which is which is totally different from the highlands, and so forth. So there is this deep divide, you know. I call it 5-decade divide within Eritrea. Besides that, even the Aurajas, you know, inside Eritrea, you know, the Aurajas, I mean, Hamasian, Saraya, Kologzai, although they are, I mean, tiny areas, you know, the difference between them and the antagonism, the bitterness between them is unimaginable. I see some kind of Auraja, not even in Tigray, but it's not as deep, as divisive, and as bitter and vindictive as it is in Eritrea. So with that, or with that kind of divisions in Eritrea, and plus add this factor, this Sha'biya factor that has been there, you know, that have totally emasculated the population. It has totally killed, you know, the nation in many ways, you know. It has dismantled the society. All the social capital of the nation has been spent. Religions have been dismantled. The Adi, for example, the village with its pillars, you know, like Baito, where you get your law, the church where you get your spirituality, or the Shimagle, the elders, where you get all the history, and all of this, you know, have been totally destroyed. And all of the institutions in Eritrea have been also hollowed out. It's not only the population that has been hollowed out. The population has been hollowed out of its young. That's what we have seen in the mass exodus. But the culture has been hollowed out. The religions has been hollowed out. You know, if the economy has been hollowed out. So it's as if, you know, if you let go of the big force, then everything crumbles. So there is specter of disintegration also facing Eritrea. I will stop there, I guess. Okay, before you stop me.
Well, no, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our webinar. UTC, United Tagaru Canada, would like to thank you gratefully for giving us your time and answering all our questions. And yeah, that's it for our webinar. Thank you very much.